see some dirty questions coming.
I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first special event of our season. We instituted these special events a few years ago in order to provide a forum within Cinema 16 at which we could present somewhat more specialized films and at which we could present somewhat more specialized topics which were of definite interest to some of our members, but not all of them. Tonight's event, I think, is a case in point. The topic, poetry in the film, is a somewhat specialized one. Nevertheless, I think it is the kind of topic that ought to be discussed at Cinema 16. For during the past 7 years, we have acted as a showcase and also as a champion of poetic and experimental films here in New York, and together with the work of the Art and Cinema Film Society on the West Coast and with the work of Miss Deren, who more than anyone else is responsible for the renaissance of the experimental film movement in the United States, we have done our small share to increase public awareness and public knowledge of experimental and poetic films. It is for this reason that we are holding this special event here tonight, and I'm very happy at this time to introduce to you the chairman of this distinguished panel, Mr. Willard Maas, a professor at Long Island University, a well-known modern poet, and also an experimental and poetic filmmaker, Mr. Willard Maas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vogel, and I must say at first that I know nothing about being a moderator, as it were, for a panel like this. It's a rather ambiguous title, I'm afraid, but I'll do my best, and you ease with me as a moderator. I hope the panel will excuse me, and I want to say something to the audience as a whole, and it's that I want to thank you for voting my film, Image in the Snow, in your popularity contest for last year. I think I was a runner-up, or I forget, maybe she came first ahead of the Maas. One of us, anyway, placed in your poll. And it's nice to be so near Miss Lamar. Seriously, though, I thank you for voting a poetic film in your group of 10 films chosen for the year. The panel here tonight, all of them among us are people that are very seriously interested in poetry and the film. I think that it's lucky that we're here and that you are here, because as Jean Cocteau in Les Arts wrote recently about the film, he said it will be the amateur, that is the, and I quote, that is the people with something to say who will save the cinema, save it from the functionaries, the theoreticians, the corporations, the bureaucrats of the cinema, from all those who have reduced the language of the cinema to an algebraic formula. And I think surely we are very grateful, those of us who are filmmakers and poets, to see so many people here tonight that are interested in this subject. I think that without that we might introduce the members of the panel. First, I'd like to introduce Miss Deren, and Mr. Vogel already has given tribute to her. I think all of us who have worked in the film know that we, in a way, have always looked to her as well, I hate to use a word like inspiration, but I suppose it is. I remember years ago I called on Miss Deren when I was a poet and knew nothing about the film, and saw Miss Deren alone, without financial support, or without encouragement from anyone, sort of splicing with her hands like this, film together. And she, as a leader of the avant-garde film, deserves enormous credit for that, I believe. It wasn't certainly something to me, and I began making films myself as related to poetry. Miss Deren has made numerous films, which I'm sure that some of you have seen. She's an author. She's a lecturer. Her films have been shown all over the world, and she indeed is the leader of the avant-garde film movement here. And as I've said before, we can all look to her as being the person that makes us realize that we don't have to look to Hollywood, we don't have to look to anywhere to make films if we're interested in them. You get a camera, you start. If you're an artist and if you're a poet, then you'll make them that way. Mr. Thomas is so distinguished a writer that I don't think he needs introduction. He's certainly the greatest living lyric English poet. But I think more important than that, one might be that on paper, Mr. Thomas is also a great reader of poetry. He is restored to the platform and to the stage, something that the Elizabethan theater had. And indeed, in that way, he's unique. Mr. Thomas, besides being a distinguished poet, has worked in the film. He does not look askance at, I guess, picking up a quick buck anywhere. But that isn't the point. The point is that wherever he has worked as a poet. And he has worked as a poet, and he has done commentary for films. Recently, just very recently in New York, has been published the first scenario that's ever been published for a film before the film was made. And I think that's of historical importance in many ways. Mr. Tyler is not only a poet and a dramatist, but he is indeed, and I want to emphasize that very much, the only critic of any importance in the United States that seriously has considered the film as an art. The devotion and dedication for 10 years of examining the films has been of extreme importance to American letters. I don't know of any critic that has devoted himself like Mr. Tyler has to examination of the film. People have written critical reviews of it. They've held important positions on the papers. Mr. Tyler has been a pioneer in criticism of the film. That isn't, of course, Mr. Tyler's only distinction. He happens to be a poet and a dramatist of a great deal of distinction. Yet currently is writing a new play, which I hope that we'll all see very soon. Mr. Miller needs no introduction anywhere. Here, he is America's leading playwright. And that isn't, although lots of playwrights haven't taken the interest in the arts as Mr. Miller has. He has been interested in the production of his Death of a Salesman in Hollywood. And I informed Mr. Miller tonight that his film, Death of a Salesman, had won a much better distinction than we have here by the Oscar of winning the Sight and Sound Award for being the best film in America. And Mr. Miller has also worked in the films very intimately, and I know Mr. Miller, and I know that he has a greater interest in the film than just an academic one. And I hope that you forgive me, but I saw in a gossip column today, I say this is a bit of humor, that Marilyn Monroe has named you as one of the 10 most fascinating men in America. And
all the rest pales.
And I'm sure it must be disappointing to Mr. Miller that Miss Monroe said that it was for intellectual reasons. I'm just trying to make my panel glamorous. You know, the connection head of the mind, Marilyn Monroe. Well, in a pre-panel discussion earlier in this week with the majority of the panel, we decided that maybe the best way to start this discussion would be to try to have the members of the panel outline, or at least present, some of the basic aesthetic principles of the poetic film. And therefore, I think I'd like to call on Mr. Tyler first to make whatever remarks he has about those basic aesthetic principles, which are really very important that we start there. We can go on anywhere later. I think that we ought to, each one of us, say something. Of course, I, as a moderator, don't have very much to say about it. I'm just trying to stop the hair from flying or start it from flying. But let the rest of them say something about that.
Thank you. Well, my thought was, since conceivably a question rather than an assumption by which the symposium will proceed tonight, is the question of what poetry in and outside the film actually is, that perhaps it would be necessary for such a demonstration to conceive it at the start and honestly as being faced with the two horns of a dilemma. Now that dilemma is, on the one hand, there's the theory of poetry, its possibilities as such in the film medium, and on the other hand, the practice of poetry as concentrated in the avant-garde film. Now it's to be hoped that we won't snag on either of these, but will steer a just course between them. Now, I thought that we might get an overall picture of the field to be surveyed. And to that end, I'd like to give you a memorandum, so to speak, of the types of poetical expression that do appear in films today. That is, these expressions may be whole or fragmentary. They may be pure or impure, but at least they exist, and they ought to be recognized as such. Now, poetical expression falls rather automatically, I think, into two groups. That is, poetry as a visual medium and poetry as a verbal medium, or in a larger sense, as auditory, and that would include, of course, music. We might well begin with some of the most famous of the shorter films, which concentrate on the visual poetry as the visual medium. And that, of course, leads right to Cocteau's Blood of a Poet, and to Buñuel Dali's Andalusian Dog, and to Watson's Lot in Sodom. All of these are classics now, and they emphasize a surrealist poetry of the image, and gave rise to schools and styles of avant-garde all over the world. Cinema 16 patrons are familiar with some of these outstanding works. those of Miss Deren, of James Broughton, of Curtis Harrington, of Kenneth Angus. Now, these filmmakers concentrated on what might be called pure cinema, entirely without words as a rule, although sometimes with music. Then to go back, after all, the avant-garde movement in poetry in America does go rather far back, at least to the 20s, and I know there was a type of film which got the name of cinepoem, and these films were impressionistic, but they concentrated on pictorial conceptions of city life, of nature, and importantly, they stressed abstract patterning. Then, of course, there's the poetry of painting in motion, the pure abstract film, which also has a considerable history. There's Norman McLaren's that Cinema 16 patrons are familiar with, the Whitney brothers, and many others. Then, also as a candidate in this list, perhaps disputable, but at any rate, certainly worth mentioning, a school of naturalistic poetry, of which Robert Flaherty was the pioneer. And we presume that his films can be considered integral without the commentary. And finally, I would include the dream and hallucination sequences with sound effects sometimes that appear in commercial films. Now, poetry as a visual verbal medium. We have the fantasy films of Jean Vigo, with which Cinema 16 patrons, I think, are familiar. Now, these films are primarily visual, and they're the avant-garde films which are set to poems or to poetic prose, those of Willard Maas, of Sidney Peterson, of Ian Hugo. Then there's what I would term the severe formalism of Sergei Eisenstein, whose montage borders on pure poetry. Then there, of course, the Cocteau myth films, Beauty and the Beast, The Eternal Return, and Orpheus. And then we might include also a special class of naturalistic poetry documents, such as The River and Blood of the Beasts, which you saw here at Cinema 16. Of course, they had commentary. Then, to conclude, the 50-50 fusion, that is, Shakespeare's plays, Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, and the numerous operas which have been filmed. Now, these are admittedly only the main leads of a very broad field indeed. Many definitions are required in order to isolate the poetic content and the poetic potentialities in these various manifestations, these types of poetical expression. And above all, the indications of value that have to be made. I'm sure that the members of the panel, including myself, have a number of significant distinctions and perhaps some even more important opinions on these aspects. Maas?
Well, Miss Deren, will you take over from there?
I'm going to do something which I think is a bit risky, and that is to go a little bit into the question of what is poetry and what distinguishes what we would call poetry from anything else, because I think that only if we get this straight can we sensibly discuss poetry in film or the poetic film or anything else. Now, I say that it's risky because this is a subject that's been discussed for many, many centuries, and it's been very difficult to pin down. But the reason I'm going into it is not because I think distinctions are important as formula and as rigidities, but I think they're important in the sense that they give an audience or any potential audience a preparation, an approach to what they're going to see, in the sense that if they are thinking that they're going to see an adventure film, for example, and they are confronted with a poetic film, that's not going to go very well. I don't think that one is always predisposed towards poetry, and the whole notion of distinguishing and, if you will, labeling things is not a matter of confining them so much as a matter of giving a clue to the frame of mind which you bring to it. In other words, what are you going to be watching as this unrolls? What are you going to be listening for? If you're watching for what happens, you might not get the point of some of the retardations because they're concerned with how it happens. Now, poetry, to my mind, consists not in its characteristics, which may be assonance or rhythm or rhyme or any of these other qualities which we associate as being characteristic of poetry. Poetry, to my mind, is an approach to experience, in the sense that a poet is looking at the same experience that a dramatist may be looking at. It comes out differently because they're looking at it from a different point of view, and they are concerned with different elements in it. Now, the characteristics of poetry, such as rhyme or color or any of those emotional qualities which we attach to the poetic work, they also may be present in works which are not poetry, and this will confuse us. The distinction of poetry is its construction, is what I mean by a poetic structure. And the poetic construct arises from the fact, if you will, that it is a vertical investigation of a situation, in that it probes the moment, probes the ramifications of the moment, and is concerned with its qualities and its depths, so that you have poetry concerned, in a sense, not with what is occurring, but with what it feels like or what it means. A poem, to my mind, creates visible or auditory forms for something that is invisible, which is the feeling or the emotion or the metaphysical content of a moment. Now, it also may include action, but its attack is what I call the vertical attack. And this may be a little bit clearer if you contrast it to what I would call the horizontal attack of a drama, which is concerned with the development from situation to situation, whereas a poem is concerned with the development, let's say, within a very small situation from feeling to feeling. Now, perhaps it would be made most clear if you take a Shakespearean work which combines the two movements. In Shakespeare, you have the drama moving forward on a horizontal development of one circumstance, one action, and so on, leading to another, and this delineates the character. Every once in a while, however, he arrives at a point of action where he wants to illuminate the meaning of this moment in the drama. And at that moment, he builds a pyramid or investigates it vertically, if you will, so that you have a horizontal development with periodic vertical investigations, which are the poems, which are the monologues. Now, if you consider it this way, then you can think of any kind of combination being possible. You can have operas, in which the horizontal development is virtually unimportant. The plots are very silly, but they serve as an excuse for stringing a number of arias, which are essentially lyric statements. Lieder are, in singing, comparable to the lyric poem. And you can see that all sorts of combinations would be possible. Now, it seems to me that in many films, very often in the opening passages, you get the camera establishing the mood. And when it does that, cinematically, that section is quite different from the rest of the film. You know, if it's establishing New York, you get a montage of images. And that is, as it were, a poetic construct, after which what follows is a dramatic construct, which is essentially horizontal in its development. The same thing would apply to the dream sequences. They occur at moments when the intensification is carried out not by action, but by the illumination of that moment. Now, the short films, to my mind, and they are short because it is difficult to maintain such intensity for a long period of time, are comparable to lyric poems, and they are completely a vertical, or what I would call a poetic construct. And they are complete as such. One of the combinations that would be possible would be to have a film which has a dramatic construct visually, which is accompanied by a commentary which is essentially poetic. That is, it illuminates the moments as they occur, so that you have a chain of moments developing, and each one of them is illuminated. It's things of this sort that I believe occur in Mr. Maas's work, who has, I think, done that to a certain extent in the last film, Image in the Snow, where the development of the film is very largely horizontal. That is, there is a storyline, and this is illuminated constantly by the poetic commentary, so that you have two actions going on simultaneously. Now, this, I think, is one of the great potentials of film, and something that could very well be carried and developed much further. And I think this is one of the distinctions of that film, and also of Geography of the Body, is that it combines these principles. I think that, to my mind, I think that this gives a kind of way of handling poetry and film, and poetry in film, and I don't know how the other people feel about it.
Well, Mr. Thomas, being a poet, what do you feel about this?
Well, I'm sure that all that my Deren said was what I would have said had I thought of it or understood it.
Does that mean you didn't understand it?
And then I was asked on the side whether that meant that I thought that the audience didn't understand what Miss Deren was saying. I'm sure they did, and I wish I was down there. Perhaps it sounds different from that side, you know. You know, I'm all for. I'm in the wrong place, I think. But I'm all for horizontal and vertical and everything, you know. And all for what we've heard about avant-garde. The only avant-garde play I saw, not this is off the point, but the only avant-garde play I saw in New York was in a cellar or a sewer or somewhere, and it happened to be with Mr. Miller over there, and we saw this play going on, and I'm sure it was fine, And in the middle he said, "Good God, this is avant-garde." He said, in a moment the hero is going to take his clothes off.
Did he?
He did.
All too good.
But I don't know. I mean, I haven't a theory to my back, as they say. But there are all through the films that I've seen all my life. There have always been bits that seem to me. Now this is a bit of poetry. They might have been in the UFA films or something that I saw as a child. Just somebody coming down with some murderous, dark, silent street, apart from the piano playing. Or it might have been a little moment when Laurel and Hardy were failing to get a piano up or down a flight of stairs. But that always seemed to me the poetry, and the words. And when those moments came, well, I mean, I have to go a step beyond those UFA films now to the non-silent films. In the best of those moments, the words seemed to fit. They really were the right word, even though the right word might only have been a grunt. And I'm not at all sure how I'm not sure that anywhere I want such a thing as myself as a poetic film. I think films are fine as they are, if only they were better. And I'm not quite sure that I want a new kind of film at all. While I'm recharging an almost empty mind with an almost empty battery, perhaps Mr. Miller would say something.
Well, I don't think I'll let it go at that, Mr. Thomas. Surely, you must realize that the film is the popular medium, and you, more than anybody else, have tried to bring poetry to the public from the platform. Don't you think, as popular art, in a way that Elizabethan theater was a popular art, don't you think it would be possible in some way to weld poetry to the film? Do you think that it's just a verbal thing, that it would not be possible in the way that Elizabethan drama somehow welded dramaturgy to language, that it would be possible to weld language to the film?
Well, just as a poem comes out of one image makes another in the ordinary dialectic process. That's the sort of words I've been coming here for. We had enough. I had plenty. Somebody had left out the word dialectic.
Well, you introduced it.
That had to come somewhere. Well, I may as well bring it in, you know. Well, just as I mean, as in a poem, one image breeds another. I think in a film, it's really the visual image that breeds the other one, and it's breeds and breathes it. And if it's possible to combine a verbal image with a visual image, I think this sort of horizontal way. I'd rather see horizontal films myself. You know, I know all films come down like that, but I like stories. You know, I'd like to see something going on.
Well, then why don't you write stories? You have, and very interesting ones.
Well,
but you write poetry, and it could be possible.
Well, it's just rainy days.
The visual image and poetry could be welded in some manner.
I know.
As indeed you have written a scenario And I've read that scenario, and I think it's terribly interesting. You may not have, do you think it has anything to do with poetry? I don't know.
I actually think very, very little. He didn't even have enough to do with the commercial cinema for which it was written.
Well, I think it's very interesting. You got paid for it. Well, we'll take these points up again. I'm sure Mr. Thomas will have more to say about it later. I'm afraid that on the horizontal and the vertical, it's easy to pass that off. But I think there's something to it. I really do. And we'll have more to say about it. And it's good that we start right here by having a difference about that. Mr. Thomas has written for the film, and I don't know if it's poetry or not poetry, but I think that a poet can't write for the film without introducing that method. I really don't. I think the poetic method is quite different from the prose method in many ways. And I shouldn't be saying anything. I'm a moderator. So, Mr. Miller, you tell us about what you think.
Well, there have been about 40 different ideas that have come across this table, but it seems to me that to create a poetic film is at bottom the same problem as the drama presents when you contrast what is normally called naturalism and what is generally called a poetic drama. It comes down at bottom not to techniques. Those are rather, I think, at least they are to me, the natural end result that comes out of what the writer wishes to say. And the only criticism I would have of such a discussion as this is that it is not tied to what anybody wishes to say. If I'm speaking to you now with a reasonable amount of confusion, I will sound confused, and I will speak in this tone of voice. If, on the other hand, I was clearly imbued with something very emotionally important to me, I would start speaking in a different rhythm. I would possibly use some images and so forth, so that to speak in the blue without reference to our lives, without references really to the age in which we live, about this problem is an endless talk. That's the first place. On the question of the technique, there's one obvious thing to me. The motion picture image is an overwhelming fact. It is different than any other experience that we have in the arts because it is so much larger than we are. And the possibility of the poet or the writer, the possibility for him to tell a story or to transmit an emotion in that film, it seems to me, is contained within the image. So that I'm afraid, even though I am much in sympathy with Willard's desire to join poetic speech with images, that possibly in the long run it will be discovered to be a redundancy. That the poetry is in the film just as it is in the action of a play.
Yes,
first.
to agree.
And I was gratified to see that the poet's part, T.S. Eliot, not long ago said as much, that after pushing the drama around on his desk for many years, he had come to the conclusion that if the structure of the drama was not complete and beautiful, nothing he could do in the way of technical manipulation of words could get him out of the hole. I think at bottom, the structure of the film is the structure of the man's mind who made it. And if that is a mind which is striving for effect because it is striving for effect, the film will be empty, however interesting it happens to be on the surface. If it is a mind that has been able to organize its own experience, and if that experience is cohesive and of one piece, it will be a poetic film. Thomas, that the commercial films, as the gentleman on my right has said too, the commercial films are full of poetic things because at certain moments in almost any poor structure, certain accidental qualities come into synchronization, so to speak, where, as in life sometimes, one only needs to drop a package of cigarettes and the world explodes. And that symbolic action is the point of all organization in the drama as well as in the film. And I get back to the first proposition again. I think that the profitable discussion, I mean, there are undoubtedly, as already has happened here, there are many different types of poetic film, and we could go on all night speaking of them. I think that it would be profitable to speak about the special nature of any film, of the fact of images unwinding off a machine. Until that's understood, and I don't know that it is understood, I have some theories about it myself, you can't begin to make, on a methodical basis, you can't begin to create an aesthetic for that film. I don't think, understand the psychological meaning of images, any images, coming off a machine. There are basic problems, it seems to me, that could be discussed here. I've probably added no end to the confusion, but that's what I have to say at the moment.
Well, as I see it, it seems to me that we have to start thinking about the image, the visual image and the verbal image. Can they be welded in some way? And I think that's the beginning for us to think of that. I think that you must be thinking of purely dramatic action.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm thinking of. I think that the basis for my remarks is perhaps almost physiological. I think that the reason why it seems to many of us that the silent film is the purest film and the best is because it mimics the way we dream. We mostly dream silent, black and white. And a few of us claim to dream in Technicolor, but that's disputed by psychologists. It's sort of a boast. But certain people want to have more expensive dreams. But I think that, from my point of view, I've thought of it in this way, and it may be all cockeyed, but I think that the film is the closest mechanical device or aesthetic device that man has ever made, which to the structure of the dream. In a dream, the montage is of the essence of the dream. The superimposition of images in a dream is quite ordinary. The cutting in a dream is from symbolic point to symbolic point. No time is wasted. There is no fooling around between one important situation and the most important moment in the next situation. It seems to me that if we looked at the physiology of the film, so to speak, and the psychology of the film, the way it actually turns off the machine, we begin to get the whole question of style, the whole question of aesthetics changes when one sees it that way. In other words, sound in film and speech begin to seem perhaps like the redundancy they so often are in films. I'll just leave it at that for a moment. Maybe somebody else has something to say about it.
Well, Maya, I'm sure you have, Miss Deren, I'm sure you have something
Well,
to say about it.
if everyone will forgive me, Mr. Miller has made several references to the way it comes out of the machine. He obviously hasn't made a film because you have to put it in the machine, and that's awfully hard. It does begin before the machine, and it begins in the mind of the creator. And your reference to montage and so on is, if I may be permitted to return to my vertical, that is the relationship between the images in dream, in montage, and in poetry is they are related because they are held together by either an emotion or a meaning that they have in common, rather than by the logic of action. In other words, it isn't that one action leads to another action, and this is what I would call a horizontal development, but they are gathered up, brought to a center and gathered up and collected by the fact that they all refer to a common emotion, although the incidents themselves may be quite disparate. Whereas in what I called a horizontal development, the logic is a logic of actions. In a vertical development, it is a logic of a central emotion or idea which attracts to itself even disparate images which contain that central core which they have in common. This to me is the structure of poetry. So that, for example, you could have a dramatic development in the sense of a horizontal development for a while, as I said in Shakespeare, and let us take the monologues where in a poetic or a vertical structure, he brings together all various images that relate to the feeling, let us say, of indecision. Now, what I mean there by it being essentially a horizontal development is that it would have sufficed for Hamlet to say, I can't make up my mind, and that's all, and that would not have affected the drama of the play, do you see? The poetic monologue there is, as it were, outside it, or built upon it as a pyramid at that point, as a means of intensifying or illuminating that moment in the horizontal development. And the montage, and that is why film, I believe, lends itself particularly to the poetic statement, because it is essentially a montage, and therefore seems by its very nature to be a poetic medium.
That's why I'm wondering whether the words are at all necessary, you see? Because the nature of the thing itself is so condensed that it's like, well, it would be like adding music to Hamlet's soliloquies.
May I answer that?
Yeah.
The words are not necessary when they come, as in the theater, from what you see. You see, the way words are used in film, mostly, they derive from the theatrical tradition, in which what you see makes the sound you hear. And so in that sense, they would be redundant in film if they were used as a further projection from the image. However, if they were brought in on a different level, do you see, not issuing from the image which should be complete in itself, but as another dimension relating to it, then it is the two things together that make the poem. It's almost as if you were standing at a window and looking out in the street and there are children playing hopscotch. Well, that's your visual experience. Behind you in the room are women discussing hats or something, and that's your auditory experience. You stand at the place where these two come together by virtue of your presence. You see, so that what relates these two moments is your position in reference to the two of them. They don't know about each other. And so your afternoon, you who stand by the window, have a sense of afternoon which is neither the children in the street nor the women talking behind you, but a curious combination of both, and that is your resultant image. Do you see? And this is possible in film because you can put a track on it.
The only question I have is whether or not, I understand the process, but you see, in the drama, there was a time, as you know, when action was quite rudimentary, and the drama consisted of a chorus which told the audience, in effect, what happened. And sometimes it developed into a thespian coming forward and imitating action, such as we understand action today. And gradually, the drama grew into a condition where the chorus fell away, and all its comment was incorporated into the action. Now, that was, for good or ill, the development of the drama. I'm wondering now whether it's moot, whether it is to any point to arrange a scenario so that it is necessary, and if it isn't necessary, of course, it's aesthetically unwarranted, for words to be added to the organization of images. And whether that makes it more poetic, I don't think so. I think that I can see the impulse behind it, but it seems to me if it's a movie, it's a movie. Well, doesn't it seem to be something to do with who is going to make this film? I mean, is it going to be the man who has a poetical poetical idea at the beginning, who then decides to work with a film director on this thing, or is the poet going to work himself on it through words, or through nothing, but just through a poetical idea, which is both visual and verbal at the same time? If he's going to work with another director, if he's going to work with a director, rather, he's got to be so terribly close to that director that, I mean, he may as well be the same person. Then you have to have a poet who can also who can think up, who can also make a film.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I think that if there's going to be any poetic film, there must be someone, or you could work very closely with someone, that new film technique to carry out. But I think the poet could establish a scenario and a commentary that would do that.
May as well have the star as well, have Marilyn Monroe as well.
Well, Miss Deren has played in her own films, and I think Miss Deren played in them because, well, she just couldn't get people to do things that a director asked people to do unless they paid $10,000 a week. I know that myself because I'm working on a new poetic film myself with Mr. Ben Moore, another poet, and we just find that he had to play the leading role because nobody would go through the trouble to do it. You see, you're not going to get commercial people to do this, and you have to work out that. But I think those are matters that are essential to the technique of the film. What I am interested in the moment is Mr. Miller's idea about film, and I'm afraid, Mr. Miller, that I think that you think that it must always be a drama. And if it is drama, then is there not a difference between prose drama and poetic drama? There certainly is a difference between Shakespeare and even Ibsen. Don't you think so?
I wasn't thinking only of drama. Of course, there have been, as you know, poetic pictures made that are silent, as I suppose most of them, as a matter of fact, are of that kind, which are not dramas. But my preference is toward drama because I'm interested primarily in action. but it seems to me an aesthetic impurity to introduce words into a picture of any kind. I'm against it as the whole spoken idea of pictures anyway. I think it simply attests to the poverty of imagination of screenwriters, that they need the words, and the poverty of the imagination of the audience, that it demands the words. I don't think it has anything remotely to do with real film. I think that the words came in because the movies came after the theater. And the first people who moved into the movies were theater people. And the first films commercially made, many of them were simply filmed plays. There's no relationship between the theater in that sense and the film, for the simple reason I return to, a technical, physiological reason, and that is that you're looking at an image many, many, many times larger than yourself, and that changes everything. It's a redundancy to add to that image, it seems to me. I just hope that your ambition to add words to film is not because you love words so much, which you should do because you're a poet. I wouldn't want to interfere with, I think that, in other words, what you would say in words should be said in that image.
Well, you must realize that there is a difference between Shakespeare and, let us say, any dramatist of repute. I mean, there is a difference in poetic language, is there not? Or isn't there?
There is, of course. The difference, however, is not of the same quality as the difference between words and a movie. The whole posture of the Elizabethan drama, its whole stance, so to speak, is larger than life, as opposed to the modern drama, which is trying to be about the same size as life. Well, the movie starts out that way. It's almost impossible, as you know, to photograph reality in pictures and make it come out reality. I know that people have tried with cameras to destroy this leads to a humorous remark. I was involved once with a director who wanted to make pictures in New York that would look real. And they photographed and photographed, and it ended up where no matter how deep down into the East Side they went, it looked glamorous.
Yes.
And they tried to dirty the film and do everything they could to it, and I kept telling him that what was required was an organization of an idea to make this look like the East Side. You can't just photograph the East Side. My point is that in the Elizabethan drama, it takes an effort of aesthetic will to raise life larger than it is on the stage, but as soon as you point a camera at anything, it's no longer real.
Well, I think that's true. Mr. Tyler, I don't want to answer this. You haven't said anything for some time, and I think you ought to say something. You must have been thinking a lot. I'm hot under the collar about it, really, but...
Well, we are snagged on the horns of the dilemma in a way, although I'm sure we've gotten a lot of ground covered. I think one of the most interesting things is the shape of and the character of these horns. That is Miss Deren, who is let's say, a professional artist in the poetic film, started out by using a rather complex, a rather difficult technical vocabulary in order to describe her theories about what she does. Now, that's perfectly all right, but it struck Mr. Thomas as not precisely all right, and he proceeded then to talk about his very spontaneous reactions to films in terms of what he thought was poetic in them. Various little incidents, certain aspects, just points of emotion. And then Mr. Miller took over and started to talk about dreams and the pure medium of the film. Now, the fact is that both these gentlemen who are professional writers and one a professional poet expressed the very view of life, the attitude toward, cinematic attitude toward life, which Miss Deren and a number of other filmmakers started out with. And in this primitive way, they are simply reflecting perhaps the very first stage of her development, when she had the impulse to make poetic films, that is, to create images, meaningful images, through the medium of photography, of moving photography. Now, it becomes a problem, I mean, especially here tonight, as to why she started out by using a fairly difficult vocabulary, technical vocabulary, to express a sort of speciality, intellectual speciality in the way she regarded her art, and the fact that these gentlemen, speaking, I don't know, apparently from a layman's point of view, they don't make any bones about it in one way, simply use a sort of, as a matter of fact, the surrealists started out by accepting parts of commercial films, jumbling them up, and making little poems out of them. Now, in other words, it's simply a question of the editing, the montage, as Mr. Miller intelligently hinted a moment ago, is a question of integrating a series of photographs, of instantaneous shots, into a form, a shape, and then you have something. That is, you have a feeling about reality, which is what art is. So I think that certainly the rudimentary ground is present. That is, poetic film means using the film as a conscious and exclusive means of creating ideas through images. And as for poets and other artists collaborating with filmmakers, the method of Eisenstein was one of strict collaboration in a technical sense, and it was also one of literature in that he wrote out very detailed, very elaborate scripts, action for action, shot for shot, beforehand, and then when he was in the field, he remained open. Being an artist, he remained open so that his technical advisors were always listened to, and it was a question of using an original script, which was really literature, which was really writing, as a starting point, and out of this kind of literature, creating a film work. And certainly among big filmmakers, among artists who created full-length films and films that were commercially distributed, Eisenstein was certainly, in the history of film, the most conscious artist. So it seems to me that it's just a little strange that Mr. Miller, in particular, being a dramatist, should take a purist point of view toward the film. I mean, that's his privilege. If he feels that way, it's one way of feeling, but the odd part, at least to me, is that this is the way that the little filmmakers, the poets of the film, such as Miss Deren, this is their approach to life. Now, I don't know where we are, except that it's a question of how much literature, what role literature, what role verbal poetry can have in film. I don't know why Mr. Thomas and Mr. Miller would insist, and I'm waiting to find out if they will insist, that poetry as literature should not, or cannot, collaborate with poetry as film.
By writing in a poetic form, almost very much some of the scriptures you've seen, particularly those that have not been produced, were written as poems. And Eisenstein, his entire life, was trying to solve that problem. He didn't have it so much to solve because he was working so frequently in documentary and in the image, but he worried very much about that. Miss Deren, I think you ought to have the last word. It's getting late, and I don't know where we've gotten. We've said a few things, and I think that we have some illumination at least, and I think a lady ought to have the last word. And then I should like, in the last 15 minutes, I know that several distinguished poets and writers and critics are here tonight. And if you would like to say something at this rather historical symposium in a way, say it. Just put your hand up and I'll call on you. I can't recognize you all from this distance here, but I know there are several in the audience. I know there are musicians, I know there are dancers, I know there's people that are interested in this. Miss Deren, you say the last word.
I wish mainly to say that I'm a little bit flabbergasted at the fact that people who have handled words with such dexterity and complexity as Mr. Thomas and Mr. Miller and Mr. Tyler should have difficulty with such a simple idea as the vertical and the horizontal. To me, the most elementary movements in the world, and really quite fundamental.
I don't think we ought to get vulgar.
And that really has rather flabbergasted me to the extent that I'm unable to develop the idea any further.
Excuse me, I would like to say that the reason I didn't mention those words is that I am at ease with them.
Well, thank you, Mr. Tyler. I don't see anything quite so difficult either in the notion that what I've called a horizontal development is more or less of a narrative development, such as occurs in drama, from action to action, and that a vertical development, such as occurs in poetry, is a sort of plunging down or a construction which is based on the intent of the moment, so that, for example, from a short story, one should be able to deduce the life of the hero before and after. In other words, the chosen moment should be of such significance that one can deduce all history from it. So in a poem, in a way, from the emotion, one can particularize to the incidents which might contain it, whereas in a drama, one generalizes the emotion from the particular instance, and that is, the actions of a drama may not be personally known, but one generalizes the emotion that comes from it, and then it becomes possible to identify with it as a generalized emotion. I still don't know what's so difficult about those two differences, and I think I'd like to hear something from the floor myself.
Well, let me just say that it's not a question. I didn't intend to make it seem so difficult. It isn't. It's just not separate. There's no separation in my mind between a horizontal story and the plumbing of its meaning and depth.
Well, surely, Mr. Miller, I mean, I see that. I'm a poet and you are a dramatist. You must surely see the difference between presenting something by words of dialogue, which you do, and I do, and Mr. Thomas does, by the image. Now, Ezra Pound has said, in definition of the image, that it's emotional and intellectual complex caught in an instant of time. It's a very direct and quick way of saying things, a lyric way of saying things, while the way the dramatist is saying things, he is putting characters that speak back and forth in conflict and may in a way, because even a poem has conflict. We know that. You can't have any sort of situation, poetic or otherwise, without dramatic conflict. I agree with that. But it's quite different than developing a narrative action, then presenting it imagistically and quickly through a method of image. And I think in the film, you can do that. You can do it by word, you can do it by visual image, and the combination of two, which is a very complicated thing. And no one has here tonight, though mentioned, talked very extensively about Jean Cocteau's Blood of a Poet. Anybody that sees that sees the perfect welding of the two. It can be done. And though he is the father of the poetic film, Jean Cocteau, he's not had many forebears. Still, I know that there is a technique that could be done that, and essentially the difference, I'm afraid, is one of presenting things imagistically and presenting them narratively and by statement and by dramatic action. There's just a difference there. Well, I've got to, it's my terrible function to call this off for the moment. Now, we have a few moments left for people of the audience to talk, and are there those in the audience that would like to make a statement or direct a direct question for a few minutes?
That's one statement.
Yes? And would they come up to the mic here and talk? I know that's embarrassing, but don't let that bother you. I don't know how to work this mic either, as you see. Come on up and say something. Or direct a question toward the panel. I know there are people here. I've invited them myself. Here we are. Your name, sir?
Victor Norman.
Yes.
I seem to feel that I don't understand the topic of poetry and the film as a differentiation as you make it, because I feel that both poetry and the film are two different methods of expression of the same thing. I think that the poet, the artist, whether he is visual or optical or auditory in any form, is looking to portray an image. I think that when you talk about images, they may be either sensory by form of the ear or by the sight. Now, to try and differentiate and say poetry in the film by the use of image, I think poetry in the form of, as they were talking, rhythm, meter, and things of that nature.
No one mentioned that.
They mentioned rhythm as one expression of it. I think these are only technical differentiations between the different forms of art. I myself would turn to the picture The River, which was mentioned in the beginning, as I know I walked away from that feeling that this was the one example of poetry in the film, thinking of William Wordsworth. But in the most extent, I don't think that the words added to it. I agree with Mr. Miller. I think you receive your image independently in each form of art itself.
Well, I'm afraid that I think The River is a very bad poetic film, and I would like I just don't think so, because it doesn't carry out. It was just a documentary with words, just like any March of Time or Canadian documentary had words to it. I don't think it was a welding of it, and I think that's something that would have to be discussed very closely, but
I think you point out my topic, that the words were not necessary to portray the image. The image was there by itself. The words that were not necessary to add anything. That was the poetry of the film, if there be such a thing.
Well, you see, unfortunately, sir, sound has come to the film. I might agree with you. I might like pantomime much better. I might like the relationship as, say, Joris Ivan's little film might do, or other poetic films might do in just presenting image. But sound has come, people get adjusted to it, they demand it. Just like drama comes from the chorus to a word. And I think that's a development that we can't ignore. When you show a silent film, with the exception of Miss Deren, I might say, she's done that wonderfully in just image, you see. But I don't think it's in the way that Mr. Lawrence did it in The River. That's just something else. It's got nothing to do with poetry at all.
I'd like to leave with one question. I'd like to ask Mr. Miller why, if he could, point up The Crucible as, I think, an excellent example of a vertical showing in a drama, in a narration. I think it was more of a vertical than a horizontal.
Well, that's a word Mr. Miller hasn't discussed. But I think that it is a problem, isn't it? A poetic language and non-poetic language.
I think we're all, it's all a question of the degree, but I might say that the best example of the relationship between words and action is that while we're talking here, all these people are walking out.
I think we better walk out.
But they have been since we began.
Came to see you, Dylan.
It's to hell with that vertical and horizontal. It doesn't mean anything. I mean to say that it's any. What's that?
That's just your opinion.
Well, of course. I understand perfectly what it means, but the point of it is that if an action is worth anything emotionally, it proceeds to get deeper into its meanings as it progresses, as it congeals. And the whole intent of any good playwright is to construct such action as will finally achieve the greatest depth of meaning, so that it's simply a question of, here again, an image, which is, in one case, when you speak of vertical and horizontal, is rather mechanical. And I'm sure the lady didn't mean it that way, and that's why it was taken so absurdly. But it isn't absurd, it's just that they aren't separated in any way. A perfectly prosaic play, as we all know, can sometimes arrive at a point which is worthy of very high, which creates a very high poetic feeling. Now, it's a different problem. You've got the whole question of verse structure and so on, but the verse structure will never come without that plumbing, without that going deep. You can't implant it on a vacuous piece of material. My only point is that it's of one piece. The technique cannot be used simply because one wishes to use it.
I think it would be interesting if we had people in the related fields. Mr. Weber here. He's a distinguished musician who has worked with the film, and that's something we really have not taken up, of the relationship of music to film. We haven't even thought about that. That is an art, a very important art. Is Mr. Weber here? Well, he's not, but I know with working with him with my film, it became just as important to worry about the meaning of the music in relationship to the image, in relationship to the spoken word, as anything else. There should be an absolute welding of those all. We haven't even touched that, you see. We mostly spend our time on talking about, which Miss Deren talked about, vertical and horizontal. I think in a way she was talking about narrative and lyric. Is that right?
Yes, the gentleman who brought it up brought up the question here as to the fact that he thought poetry and film were different ways of doing the same thing. That is why I went into the whole nature of what I call the poetic structure, because I believe that this poetic structure can be present in any one of the forms. For example, in dance, you would have a narrative ballet, or you would have an essentially lyric ballet. Or you might have a ballet that was essentially narrative in its development, and which would have a pas de deux in it, which was an exploration of a moment that occurred. Then the pas de deux is over, and you go back to the line of your plot. So that I am not thinking of the poetic structure as referring simply to poetry as a verbal form. I'm thinking of it as a way of structuring in any one of a number of mediums, and that it is also possible to make the dramatic structure in any one, or that it is also possible to combine them. When Mr. Miller says he doesn't think they're different, it is another way of saying that they can be combined, in which sense he is contradicting his rather purist insistence that they should not be combined. To me, this is a rather, it comes out a contradiction. I think that they can. Now, I am speaking for a combination, although personally in my films there has not been such a combination. My films have been completely silent, and I would not have brought up this possible combination thing if I were speaking of my own films, as Mr. Parker seemed to suggest, because were I speaking of them, I would not have this combination idea or problem. I'm speaking of other films and of the way poetry occurs in them, either as image, the sudden development of a poetic image which you might have in a dream sequence of a film which was otherwise narrative in its structure. And the whole narrative stops while the hero has a dream which illuminates the particular moment in the story. And then he goes back to the narrative, somebody wakes him up or something like that, and you go on with the narrative development. It's this sort of nightmare that was present in Death of a Salesman, which was a moment in which, in effect, the action almost stopped, and you had this poetic illumination of the moment.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know something about that. You see, that's precisely the point. It didn't stop. It never stopped. This has been confused with a flashback. It was never a flashback. The design of that play is concurrent stories.
But why not talk about the movie?
Now, wait a minute, and we can get right to the movie, and here's a very good example. See, I'm wedded. The reason I'm not a good debater on this subject is because inevitably one is what one is, and you can't turn into something else when you walk onto a platform. I'm wedded to action. I can't bear narrative drama. It's, to me, an impossibility. It bores me to tears.
Well, action is narrative.
Now, wait a minute. There's a difference between narrative and dramatic, obviously. Now, the place where you would speak, I presume, of the vertical investigation, let's call it, is in those sections of the play where the man goes back into time. But
I don't see it as a flashback.
No, well, the point is, to be sure, the immediacy, the present moment vanishes in the sense that he goes back in time. But every word that is in those memories changes the situation that will arise as soon as those things are over. They are not, in other words, excursions for the sake of reaching outside the structure of the play to bring in some information. They are incorporated, completely wedded to the action. They are action. Now, the only argument I have here at all, and the reason why I have a feeling that verse possibly doesn't belong in a movie, is that if you have on the screen an image is a bad word because it seems static, an action. Now, it can be an action that is a seemingly real or a fantastic one. And then on top of it, you have an unseen narrator who is speaking. I'm afraid that the spoken word will be a kind of narrative or lyrical, non-dramatic verse. And that is going to stop the motion of the motion picture. And I'm against that. I think it's an intrusion on the medium. That's all I'm meaning. I'm speaking for an organic art. That's all.
Well, I think you're talking about the difference of drama, per se.
Let me finish that just a second, because it's a good example in the making of the movie of Death of a Salesman. Now, this was a very fascinating problem, and it is right to the point here. On the stage, it seemed perfectly all right to most people that the man should move into his memories, which were evoked by the action in the present. I didn't write the script for the movie, and I quarreled very much with it, because the curious thing happened that when one would think offhand that it would be much easier in a movie to dissolve the present, because the very word dissolve is so natural to the camera, and simply throw the man into the past. Well, what happened in the movie, and what I said earlier, was that when the present was dissolved, the meaning of what happened in the past was less. And the reason for it was that on the stage you had the present with you all the time. We couldn't remove the set. The man had his dreams in relation to the real set that he was standing on. So there was a tension involved. It was, in other words, a reproduction of reality, because when we talk to ourselves on the street is still there, and we don't vanish in thin air. The tension of the dream remained on stage. But where, in the movie, they made the terrible mistake of evaporating his surroundings so that he was thrust completely into his dream. And what happened was, it became a narrative. The conflict was that this man, after all, there's nothing quite wrong with one. It's not quite as bad to talk to yourself when you're alone on a desert as it is to talk to yourself when you're standing in front of a girl in Macy's counter. That has an entirely different meaning. In one case, the man can be quite balanced. In the other case, he begins to look as though he's losing his balance. And this is, to my mind, an analogy between stopping action with anything that stops action is bad in a picture. And I think in the movie of Death of a Salesman, the action was stopped because the visual thing that kept the tension of those memories was evaporated. And I'm afraid that the same thing would happen with the speech in the picture.
Well, then you think that, I suppose that's a note that we've got to stop. It says stop. Well, thank you, and thank the members of the panel.
I think that next time you ought to summarize.
Yeah, I think everybody ought to summarize what they said rather than I said.
I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to the first special event of our new season. We instituted these special events several years ago in order to provide a forum within Cinema 16 for the exhibition of films of somewhat more specialized interest and for the holding of discussions of somewhat more specialized interest, which definitely were of concern to a section of our membership, but not to all of it. Tonight's discussion, I think, is a case in point. The topic, poetry and the film, is a somewhat specialized one. On the other hand, I think Cinema 16 ought to be the place where a topic of this type can be discussed. For during the last 7 years, we at Cinema 16 have acted as the showcase and also as the champion of poetic and experimental films of all types, and together with the work of the Art and Cinema Society on the West Coast and Miss Deren, who more than anyone else is responsible for the renaissance of the experimental and poetic film in the United States, we have done our share, our small share, to increase public awareness and understanding of poetic and experimental films. It is for this reason that we are presenting this special event here tonight, and I'm very happy at this time to introduce to you the chairman of our distinguished panel, Mr. Willard Maas, professor at Long Island University, a well-known modern poet and filmmaker. Mr. Maas.
Thank you, Mr. Vogel. Usually, when you go to the moving pictures, you see a double feature. But tonight, the panel sees a double feature of audience. In other words, we have had a panel previously in the first session. And I think you're lucky in a way, because I think you come at the moment where we might get somewhere, if symposiums ever get anywhere. I want to thank members of the Cinema 16 audience for voting my image in the snow, those of you were here, in the popularity contest of those films that you enjoyed last fall. I'll probably never get this opportunity again. I'd like to thank you, because that a film, a theological film and a film of poetry, should be voted along with Ecstasy by Hedy Lamarr, which I'm very glad to be in the company of, should win your support. So without the sort of long preamble that I gave last time, and we're all sort of warmed up now, and you're luckier, I guess, I think that we began the discussion last time with the idea that each member of the panel would try to outline his ideas of what the basic aesthetic ideas of a poetic film was. I don't know how we achieved that, if we achieved any success at all. And I was supposed to take notes on what various people said during the evening, and I was to summarize it. Instead, I think that over a couple of drinks outside, we decided that Miss Deren would kind of introduce this subject and try also to summarize what was said in the last session. So, Ms. Deren, if you will do that. Oh, wait a minute. I am supposed to introduce the panel, and I forgot that. First, we have Miss Deren on my left, who I always feel that I ought to sort of splay myself in front of, because she's one of the very few people in America who's devoted herself consistently for the last decade in making avant-garde films. She did it, oh, I don't think that's so funny. She did it all alone, and with great discouragement at first, but she has toured over the country, and her films have won a very wide audience, and I think that her films speak for themselves. Miss Deren, besides the numerous films that she's taken, has done, is also an author and a lecturer. And Mr. Thomas is too well known a poet for me to say anything about it. I think we all in America are very appreciative that he journeys here every winter to read his poetry, which I think in a way has restored an eloquence to poetry that on the platform that has been not done in our generation. A very great reader of poetry, and of course your judgment of him as a poet has already been achieved. Mr. Tyler, I think also, if I may say all these sort of wonderful things about our panel, but it's true, and I'm very sincere about that. Mr. Tyler alone has been the only critic in America that has dealt intelligently with the film. He has consistently for a whole decade written about the film, not only analyzed the popular film, and he has written about it in his two books, Magic and Myth of the Movies and Hollywood Hallucination, his book on Chaplin, regarded the art of the film as an art, which I don't know of any other critic that has. And Mr. Tyler, of course, is a poet and a dramatist who is working at the moment on a verse drama. Mr. Miller, I don't think needs to be introduced here or anywhere as our leading American dramatist, who also is extremely interested in the art of the film. So with that out of the way, Miss Deren, will you try to summarize what we said last period? And I don't think that's so much if you could reach some sort of conclusions about it, you see, because we sort of ended in a riot, as most symposiums do.
During the intermission between the last symposium and this one, Mr. Tyler made a remark which I think bears repeating, that our function here is to help develop for film a vocabulary and a whole way of going at film. He made this remark in reference to Mr. Miller, who had, in a way, not felt that the problem is a little bit peculiar to film people, and that we have a problem in building up such a critical vocabulary and an analytical vocabulary. And this, in fact, was what I was trying to do in my opening remarks, and I think that is the purpose of this panel, to see if we can work out some way of handling the whole problem. In my opening remarks, which later were tossed back and forth at some length, I proposed the following, that there are essentially two kinds of structure. And I attached to them the very simple mathematical terms of vertical and horizontal. I proposed that the dramatic or narrative structure, where the work of art proceeds by a series of actions, where the logic is a logic of actions, as you find in most dramas, or in most stories, or in most novels, that this be, as it were, considered a horizontal structure. And that as differentiated from that would be the structure of poetry. And here Mr. Tyler later made the exception. He would be happy if I only called it lyric. Very well, I shall call it the lyric structure, which is, I called it vertical in that it investigates the particular moment, and because it investigates the particular moment as an emotion and so on, is usually marked by a particular elegance and eloquence of form. My illustration for that was Shakespeare, who writes dramas which are essentially and basically a horizontal structure. That is, they are a development of actions. actions in the exterior sense of actual activities, incidents, circumstances, and so on. And the character is illuminated in the course of these. And that periodically, when he reaches a point which seems to him to require further illumination as a moment, he creates a poetic monologue which investigates that moment as an emotion, so that you get a development dramatically, then you have a monologue such as To Be or Not to Be, which is a poetic structure and explores that particular moment. As a result of that illumination and exploration, then one returns to the dramatic development. The point is that it's essentially a drama, because if Hamlet at that point had done no more than say, I can't make up my mind, this would in no way have changed the dramatic development of the play. But Shakespeare here used the lyric or the poetic form of statement as a way of illuminating and probing the moment itself. Well, then my point was that poetic structure, as for example in film, you might have a film which was primarily a dramatic development, a story, or such as, for example, Mr. Miller had written In the Death of a Salesman, made into a film. Then at a certain moment, the intensification was done in a different way when the moment itself was investigated emotionally and built up by a montage of images and so on. So, namely the imaginary sequence. I call it imaginary because I did not feel it as a flashback. I felt it rather as a kind of summation of experience, and Mr. Miller doesn't want it to be thought of as a flashback, and it was a kind of poetical summation of experience, as a result of which the drama proceeded somewhat differently. And so that film can have these combinations of the horizontal and the vertical being used at points of intensification. And my feeling was also that, for example, the film itself might proceed as a dramatic development and have over it a commentary, as it were, that illuminated it vertically at each moment of its movement forward. Such a film is Willard Maas's film, I think, Image in the Snow, in which the film moves forward this way and is constantly illuminated by the poetic commentary this way. Of course, Jean Cocteau's film, in a sense, both the that is the prime example of a poetic or lyric structure in the film. Now, that is more or less what served as the basis of a great deal of the discussion, and I would really rather leave it to the other people to summarize their own points of view as it came up.
Well, I think that you sort of summarized what we went over, leaving out the extraneous matter. I just want to make one announcement that Mr. Miller has to catch a plane very early tomorrow morning, incredibly early, and therefore we'll have to leave in about 20 minutes. So therefore, I think I'll call on him first, and I hope later on, which we didn't have so much of in the first audience. I think the first audience is not, as a whole, the creative people. Using a cliche, I suppose they stay up at night and work. But I do know that in this audience, because I saw them out in the hall, a great many people that have worked in the film or in the related arts. And when we terminate this discussion, I hope that you will feel very free to speak from your seat or to come up to the microphone. I know it's hard to do because I never seem to move to the microphone, and give us your ideas of it. We've all talked a great deal, and we'll talk more, but I think there must be people here whose ideas are extremely interesting. Now, Mr. Miller, you've heard Miss Deren's summation of your remarks and of all our remarks, and I wonder if you have something now to say.
Well, I think that the only thing we argued before to no avail, because I don't think I understood what she was driving at, and I don't think she understood what I was driving at. And now I'm beginning to get the idea. It would be good if we could define something here, and I'm going to try to clarify a little bit what, at least I think, can be fruitfully called a poetic film. Obviously, any film has all films have certain things in common. They're all on a film, and they're all images of one kind or another. Some try to tell an objective story, an imitation of human action. Others are fantastic. They may not be trying to imitate objective human action, but psychological symbols and so forth. As you know, being people who see avant-garde films, there are endless mutations of the same material. I think the objection I had before to the lady's ideas was this. As in written poetry, as opposed to movie poetry, the question is one of degree, and that's all. As you know, there's poetic prose, and there is more and more poetic prose until a point arrives where a more or less quantitative change takes place, where it becomes verse. There's great argument as to when that change takes place, but we don't have to go into that. We could say that it takes place when meter is introduced. That's sufficient for the moment. So then both verse and poetic diction, or prose, or poetic prose, are poetic. So a commercial picture about imitating action of people, trying to be completely realistic, can be a poetic picture. It's, in effect, to use an analogy, a poetic prose picture. Then you go further along until you get more and more self-consciousness in the making of the picture, that is, artistic self-consciousness, which can be a very good thing. And the artist is intent upon making what, in effect, is a verse poetic picture. As in writing, so it seems to me in the movie art, the verse normally does not pretend to be the way people ordinarily speak. So as you get toward the end of the spectrum of poetic film, the film doesn't pretend to be the way people normally behave. Now, there is only, I think that would be generally agreed among most people. The only issue that I can see of any kind is perhaps what the most fruitful path there might be ahead of people who are interested in making movies. Since I don't make movies, that isn't really for me to say, except as a spectator and a layman. I know much less about the making of movies than most of the people sitting up here. I would only say this, that I haven't seen a great many avant-garde pictures. I've seen a few. I would only warn against an aestheticism which divorces itself too much from the communication of ideas and emotions to a sizable number of people. I think that it eventually destroys the technique too, when, as in any other form, the great challenge is to make oneself emotionally, aesthetically clear to one's fellow citizens. It's been true in Elizabethan time, and it was true in the Greek time, and those are the two greatest periods of the drama, at any rate. And I would leave it on that note. That is a warning against a too great ingrown, over-technicalized thought on this. In other words, after all, what is the whole thing for? The whole thing is a means of communication, not necessarily of a programmatic kind, but of emotional and ideological or ideational matter. And this whole, the technical thing is, after all, in the service, or should be, in the service of those more or less social quantities.
Well, as a poet and a dramatist, I would like to call on Mr. Thomas to do that.
First of all, anyway, first of all, always sounds as though one's got several other things to say, but I haven't really, because once I've spoken what I've first of all got to say, I haven't anything more to say. But well, starting at the alphabet from A to A, I think a symposium panel is the most curious, as you might notice, thing. We're only pretending to be now at our conversational ease. Though we seem to be saying what we think, we're only, of course, thinking towards what we're saying. But I think one of the troubles about this, if it is a trouble, is that we're talking about the poetic film, whatever that might be, as though it were a brand new thing, and we were the first people to be talking about it. The earliest film I ever saw was a poetic film. I don't know what it was. It might have been The Street or Atlantide or Metropolis. It was before the big cinema interests had got hold of the little cinemas. And so all sorts of films could be seen in small suburban cinemas in small provincial towns in far-off, unlikely countries like Wales. But those seem to me, in essence, to be poetical films. And now we're trying to split the poetry from the films again and separate them. I think there was a poetic cinema, there might be, but what too many of us, I'm not specifically saying people here, but also probably, or perhaps people in the audience, is that the avant-garde seems to be retrogressive. If that doesn't start someone talking, I don't know what to.
Well, what do you mean by avant-garde?
Well, it's a word that's been bandied around.
You see, that's the interesting thing that films begin, as all drama would begin, out of the church, in the courtyard. But I do think there was a development in the film, as there was a development in the drama out of the courtyard. But that isn't for me to decide. I wonder, Mr. Tyler, if you'd have something to say about that. Passing the buck, this is called.
Well, the beautiful thing about this symposium is that it seems to me that everybody, I won't include myself, I believe that open, but Mr. Miller and Mr. Thomas have really created an iridescence, a sort of iridescence of idea and viewpoint, and it has to do a great deal with their own personalities, and that's fine. But Miss Deren, on the other hand, has hewed to the line in a very, very dogged way, and I don't know that we shouldn't take off from her note of seriousness. What Mr. Miller said and what Mr. Thomas just said has point. As to exactly where it points, one doesn't exactly know offhand, but it could point to a great deal. Now, it's perfectly true that the poetic film is not new. That point was made before. The point was made that filmmakers and poets, young poets like Mr. Thomas, who are in the audience, saw in all kinds of films the poetic appear iridescently and disappear just as iridescently and just as quickly. And a kind of sensibility that can be called poetic came into being. And a number of foreign films that Mr. Thomas saw had genuine inspiration, genuine talent, the ability to use the film medium, and so consequently they created a number of effects of visual poetry. But the Scylla and Charybdis on which the discussion so far seems to have landed is a very old one. It's the old one of the difference between two kinds of reality, between a kind of literal, everyday reality, a kind of naturalism, a descriptiveness that's peculiar to prose, and a kind of reality that only the mind sees, of which dreams and hallucinations and intense lyric poetry are the natural expressions. Now, in film, there's developed a kind of feeling that corresponds to the feeling for words, a direct feeling for words and the direct feeling for images in poetry as an elementary thing, not whether one starts out to write a dramatic poem or to write a play or to write a lyric, but an elementary feeling for a way of putting images together. Now, one man has done this preeminently, and he's written some books. I mean Sergei Eisenstein, of course. And Eisenstein showed, both by practice and theory, that the way to put a film together is, to a large extent, the way figures of speech, the way metaphors are put together. He called his theory montage. Now, this elementary means, this elementary language can be significant, meaningful, and exist on a high level according to the emotion that's behind it. Now, the idea, the emotion that a filmmaker has may be uplifting. In any case, he goes about it in a way, if he's serious, that has poetic elements in the sense that all literature is based upon imagination and is based upon figure of speech, and when these are used with real feeling, with a fundamental purpose in mind, they do rise toward the level of poetry. Now, I trust that's shed a little light.
Well, as Mr. Miller has to go in just a minute, I think that whatever Mr. Miller would like to say, I think he ought to say now. We ought to permit him to go. He said he'd rather keep his peace, but can we let you keep it?
I'll wait a few minutes. Go ahead.
Have you something to say, Mr. Thomas?
Well, only going back again to what I said at the beginning, if anyone has sufficient long memory. Was this, as it seemed to me, a terrible splitting up, which I'm sure Madame will talk about, the splitting up of these various elements. It's just like surrealists coming along and finding that in all surrealist paintings there was surrealism. They extract that element and then say, this is it. This is the whole of art, the whole of painting. That should have a semicolon, but I can't come up. Maya.
After a semicolon? I can't follow a semicolon.
A horizontal colon.
I think Mr. Thomas speaks from a position that he has earned, and he says, why bother pulling it all apart if you can do it? Well, he can do it, and so he doesn't have to bother pulling it apart. It might interest him to pull it apart, and to pull it apart to a certain extent, more to clarify it for other people than to serve as a formula for creation. The distinctions which are attempted here are not formula. They're attempt to locate and have a general idea of what we're dealing with, so that we don't end up with the, well, it may be art, but I don't like it sort of thing, and if I like it, it must be art, which is actually where Mr. Thomas's point would point.
Well, mine might be, excuse me, mine might be that it's art, but I don't like it.
Well, either one of the two. However, the problem here is to try to arrive at certain distinctions, because that's what we're here for, so let's do it.
I was wondering why.
I should like to take up at a point where Mr. Tyler began suggesting, and that is to go a little bit further into the possible language that film has, which is comparable to the poetic use of words. For example, in film, you might have such things as a repetition of a sequence, or you might have certain way of handling images which would be comparable to alliteration in a language. You would have a certain phrasing. There would be a great attention to the rhythm of the editing, which would be very similar to the attention a poet pays to the phrasing of his syntax and so on. There are various ways in which, on a purely visual level, the film contains the same or comparable elements to language for a visual poetic structure. In a poetic film, there is this emphasis upon these formal. It rises to eloquence visually in the same way that language becomes peculiarly eloquent in poetry. As a filmmaker, I'm extremely aware of this part. The other aspect of the form that is involved here is not simply the poeticizing, is that right, of the film image, but also the relating of poetry as a verbal form to the film image. And perhaps Mr. Maas would have, who has done so much in this direction, would have something to say here.
Well, in the first place, Mr. Thomas, I just considered the subject. You must admit, if I may just take issue with you for an instant, that, say you're under the milkwood, which I consider a very beautiful and great achievement, would be different than in your language that you use than the ordinary language, wouldn't it?
Yes, certainly. It wasn't meant to be in the language of normal speech.
Exactly.
Just sort of with blood pressure.
Well, I think that there could be people that could write films, as I think Jean Cocteau has. And I don't think that we've talked enough about Jean Cocteau's Blood of a Poet, which it seems to me was the first film that attempted this. There is a film that I think that carries out Miss Deren's and my own conception of welding the verbal to the poetic image. I've worked in this a long time. Mr. George Barker, an English poet, and a contemporary Mr. Thomas's, and I, as rather a camp, I suppose, started out making a film, which we tried to do this. We didn't succeed too tremendously. You'll see this film on your program this spring. But we realized the possibility, knowing nothing about the camera. We just had a camera put in our hands, and we were both he taken to England and I drafted in the army. We had nothing to do, and no money, and no space to make a little film. And we had nothing around about us but bodies, so we made it, and it's called Geography of the Body. We were interested in making first a poetically visual film. I don't think it's too successful poetically in that way. We didn't conceive it with verbal part of it. We just thought of it first visually, then we suddenly realized that we had a great area to work in here, that we could add verbal commentary to this, which would in some cases explain, and in other times contradict what we were saying or juxtapose them, just as one does in poetry and image. Now, I think the most important thing about the medium of film and poetry, and I know Mr. Thomas is interested in that because he appears on the platform and reads poetry. He has restored poetry to a verbal medium. In a sense, and I'm very sincere about this, that the Elizabethans have. I think that the film, being a medium that is popular and understood by a great number of people, might be a vehicle for restoring poetry in a verbal way to a public. Now, I'd just like to think, is that possibility, Mr. Thomas?
Well, that goes back again to what we were. This sounds like the second part of a serial, and I don't know who's going to be hanging over the end of the cliff at the end. Followed next week. Is it how closely are the other people going to collaborate? How much is this to be made? You take one poet a poet like George Barker with no film experience at all, who's always been writing for the printed page, always so that you can see his words. You can see them with your eye. You can hear them with the voice of your eye, unless you also speak them aloud or hear them spoken aloud. How closely has he got to work with, if he's interested in this medium at all? How closely has he got to work with a man who does know how to move a camera, who does know what to do, and how closely has that man got to be to the final editing of the film, and also, are you going to have yet a third one in? Are you going to add music as well?
Of course we add music, and that's the point. Why?
And all you want is smellies, and you've got the whole business.
Well, why shouldn't we have music?
Yeah.
There is no reason why even a drama, a play, shouldn't have music. I mean, after all, the troubadours sang songs, and I'm sure that if you could compose music, you would like it. But I do think there is a possibility, in the same way as the Elizabethan dramatists worked together, that there could be a possibility of poets and musicians working together.
Working then in a film studio as poets used to work in a theater.
You talk about a film studio, Mr. Thomas, you ought to come down and see mine, or Miss Deren's, or all those of us who are trying to do this thing. We don't talk about commercial films. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. I'm sure it could be done. But at the moment, it seems to me that those that are interested in poetry as a medium for the film must take it upon themselves to learn or become intimate enough to those people that do know to collaborate in a production of this sort, just as opera or any other medium that uses music. I know in my last film, Angels in the Snow, I collaborated very closely. If I knew music, it would be better, of course. It would be a great art if one knew we're a great musician, we're a great cameraman, and we're a great poet. And I think, in a sense, that's the great achievement of Jean Cocteau. He was able to do that.
Yes, I think the thing that's bothering Mr. Thomas is that willy-nilly he's been bullied by the idea of specialization, and he's begun to believe in it in a certain way, although he's not aware of it. In other words, he's terribly worried about the business of not sticking to your own thing. He wants films to be silent, and he wants them to be poetic in an imagistic sense and leave the words out. Then poetry is going to be poetry, and music is going to be music, and in this sense, perhaps without knowing it, he's permitted himself to become bullied by the specializations of an industrial age where the notion of this guy puts on the fender and this guy puts in the headlights and so on, and he is protecting, I think, art from becoming a mass-produced thing where a different man puts on all the different parts. I think in trying to reunite verbal poetry with visual poetry, with musical poetry, and trying to bring these things back together, it's a job. And it is once more, I think, in a way, a revolt against the specializations. I know on my part it is, and I think on Mr. Maas's part it is, a revolt against the purisms of specialization, which are called purisms and aesthetics, but they're actually just industrial specializations when you look at it, and to come back to the notion of the total man, the total artist, and the total audience, the audience which can take in by the ear and by the eye at the same time, instead of sitting there and just looking as if they were deaf, or having to only hear as if they were blind. The notion of the total man in the audience and the total man as the creator of a work, creating as the great works have been, created for the eye, for the ear, and for as many of the senses as possible. In a sense, this is what Mr. Maas is trying to do. This is what Jean Cocteau has succeeded in doing very brilliantly, in that you are required to exercise all your senses, or practically all your senses at the same time. These are total artists working for an audience composed of total men and not of robos who are now tuned in on the ear or now tuned in on the eye. And I think that it is, to me, a little bit peculiar that Mr. Thomas should take objection to it, because I think that as a poet, he certainly expresses the concept rather of the courageous totality. And in his poems, that to me seems to be the vigor of his talent, is that he is not afraid. My point in this is trying to make him see that this is what we're trying to drive at in the combination of these various things. The total man, which I'm sure he is basically in agreement with.
Well, I just want to say one thing, and I think that negates something Mr. Thomas says, that poetry before Mr. Thomas came on the scene was largely verbal, printed. People read it in books and so forth, and Mr. Thomas, by just his voice, just his talent, and just his genius at reading it, brought it to a very great public, Mr. Thomas, and I think that that could be extended in other ways. Don't you think so?
I like you, too. I don't know, so I was just lost in a haze of self-admiration at that moment. Just wondering who this was you were talking about.
Well,
but, no, I mean, nobody could be obviously more in agreement about a total man than a sort of mixed up little chap like myself, obviously. But I mean, what I really am interested myself in this is how are all these untotal people going to get to work together?
I suppose through love.
Well, that hasn't done much so far, I must say. But,
well, I disagree with you there. Very much.
Look
so.
where it's got people now. I don't know. I mean, it's still worth going on with, I suppose. But
I don't want to change the subject, but Mr. Cocteau, who Don Thomas says worked commercially with a great many films. After his first film, Blood of a Pit, he gave it up in a failure, I suppose, in the way you did, because he had, I mean, you have written for the film, oddly enough, but he wrote it, I suppose, as a sort of commercial way. You didn't think of extending your entire poetic talents toward that way. But in a recent issue of Les Arts, Jean Cocteau said, and this is my point that I make very much, before Mr. Tyler, who's been so silent for a long time,
so patient,
patiently silent, said, it will be the amateur, that is, the people with something to say, who will save the cinema, save it from the functionaries, the theoreticians, the corporations, and the bureaucrats of the cinema, from all those who have reduced the language of the cinema to an algebraic formula, to complete cliche. Where can we find an audience that would listen to it? And I say it's you. And I do think it can be done, and only by faith and by very hard work can it be done. Mr. Tyler, what do you say about it?
Well, I think it's very natural that filmmakers should be more aware of the possibilities of fusing the verbal and the visual, simply because they've tackled a very new medium. That is, the film medium is roughly only a little over half a century old, whereas literature and poetry have existed for centuries and centuries. But I'm sorry Mr. Miller retired, because he rather sprung one by taking, in the first session that we had, a point of view that's characteristic of young filmmakers. That is a purist point of view, that the words do not contribute very much, that the film can accomplish all it has to accomplish simply through photography. So at the same time, it's this organic thing which Mr. Thomas has also emphasized. That is, it is a question of bringing to the film laboratory a sense of working with a collaborator in words. That is, a filmmaker working with a word maker very, very intimately and very closely. And it just seems that Mr. Miller and Mr. Thomas can't quite visualize that. I think that's pretty personal. And they're within their rights, but it doesn't seem to me there's any theoretical reason why two workers in different media cannot get together and produce a work which is both verbal and visual. And I do think that Mr. Maas exaggerates a little the achievement of Jean Cocteau, but because he's compromised with commercial standards and commercial patterns. But at the same time, he has opened up a way, and he has indicated the proper methods and the proper viewpoints and the proper appreciation of poetry as a medium in itself, a medium which can be used in making a big film, a film with a big design, with a narrative design and a dramatic design. And I can easily understand, too, why Miss Deren is willing to take what looked at first like a non-purist point of view, that is, although her own films are all silent up to now with the exception of a couple with music, that she's willing to foresee the possibility of a real achievement in a combined medium. It seems to me that this shows vision, and there is no reason, I would insist theoretically, why it isn't possible. So we've been faced up here with this peculiar situation of two writers who take a purist point of view, a point of view that, according to Miss Deren, is now in the art of the avant-garde film outmoded. One can make of that what he likes.
Well, I think at this point it would be good if we could hear from somebody from the audience. I know even among those that have worked on films, and I think those that worked on the dance, I think that in some sense poetry should be restored to the same position it had in ancient ritual, where, as a leading critic of our time pointed out, where the seen and the heard could be joined. I see no reason why that couldn't be done. I know there are poets present, and there are some filmmakers present, and there are dancers present, and there are musicians present. And by the way, we haven't even touched on that problem of music with the film, which is extremely important if you're going to have a complete synthesis of all these arts.
May I just say a word? In the idea of collaboration being possible, my own personal experience has been that it's remarkably easier than anyone would have expected. The film which I am now completing, for example, was done actually in collaboration with Anthony Tudor, and I must say both of us approached it with extreme trepidation, because he has a reputation for being very much himself when he's choreographing, and there have been people who said that it would be unthinkable to think of collaborating with Miss Deren. So the thing that happened, however, was that we didn't have one blessed moment of friction. Not at all. It was quite easy, because we were working from the same center. Once we got the central idea clear and were agreed upon it, which I grant had to occur, that he had an essential sympathy for the basic idea, and I too, that he was able to realize it in terms of physical dance movements, and this considering the camera, and I was carrying it out filmically, and we got along beautifully, and it wasn't nearly as awkward as anybody would have thought it to be. I'm sure the same thing occurs with musicians and so on. I think that Mr. Thomas has perhaps had some very unfortunate personal experiences with the commercial.
That's right.
That's it. It's his own background that's actually influencing. So he's probably had very unfortunate experiences with commercial studios, and the inability of an ordinary commercially trained cameraman to grasp certain points. And he has reacted against that into a feeling that it is virtually impossible. But if you get two artists together, not try to combine an artist with a hack technician, but if you get two artists functioning on the same level in their respective fields, I think that collaboration is much more possible than he seems to feel it.
Yes, I'm sure it is. It is absolutely fine. And, as long as as long as the collaborators approach each other without any pretension that one is in a better or finer or any other kind of medium than the other, as long as it's done without patronizing from both sides, and as long as the result, as long as their idea of the result is vague and ignorant, they might produce something clear and if not necessarily wise, at least not particularly foolish.
Well, I think even your actors that do your play, Mr. Thomas, that's a collaboration of a sort, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Yes, and I think that there could be others.
That was a sort of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Of course it is. And they lend distinction to it. Will someone of those present wish something to say? I wish you would. I know there are people here. I just know that I've worked with that are present that would like to say something, and you must not feel shy. Is Mr. Blachevsky? Yes?
I think that the forum doesn't make difference between poetry in the film and poetry as a film form.
Excuse me, I didn't hear your question, sir. If you could come down to the microphone, it would be very helpful.
There's one over there.
Right over here.
I think that the forum doesn't make any difference between poetry in the film and poetry as a film form. It means the forum doesn't make difference between productions or Ford's films that have poetry, many poetical sequences and images, but films, for instance, Broughton's films or Miss Deren's films or Maas films are different because those films are has poetry as form. Because the difference between novel and a poem is a difference of form. A poem and a novel has poetry, but the difference is in form. The same is with the film.
Well, Mr. Tyler, you are a critic, and what would you say about that?
Well, it appears that the gentleman did not quite understand Miss Deren's original distinction between the lyric and the dramatic structure. It's perfectly true that Pudovkin and Eisenstein and the Russian school use a kind of surface of reality, and by simply editing and constructing and giving form to the film shots, create a kind of poetry of physical action which can be observed in an everyday way, whereas Miss Deren's films are dreamlike and are fantasies and have a psychological status. That is, they make much more use of the figure of speech to transpose the figure of speech. And it seems to me that this is the difference that the gentleman is talking about. I don't know if I'm right.
May I?
Yes?
I think that what is troubling the gentleman is that in certain films, the lyric occurs periodically as a way of heightening a particular movement which is essentially dramatic in its development. In referring, for example, to my films or to Mr. Maas's films, he has referred to films which are only the lyric. In other words, they are completely lyric. But there are other films in which the lyric occurs periodically as a salute to a certain moment in the dramatic development. I think that's the difference, is that, for example, again, to come back to Shakespeare, which is a marvelous example of this, you could remove the monologues and they would be almost perfect lyrics in themselves, because they do not affect substantially the dramatic structure. Now, in this sense, he's impure, but he uses the lyric. It's as if he brought action as far as it could go, and then to further intensify it, he went into another direction, and he intensifies that moment, and then having intensified it, he returns to the dramatic development.
Well, I'm not sure that the monologues are particularly lyric, but I do know this. I like this point of yours, that there are pause where, for example, philosophic statement can be made before the action goes on somewhere else. Are there other people that would like to say something? I wish there were. Yes? Would you mind speaking to the microphone?
I think we can hear.
Yeah, or maybe we can hear you here.
I'm just wondering why on a symposium like that, several, maybe 2 to 3 examples on a film should be given to illuminate this symposium and at the same time explain better to people who are not able to understand or they can see it the way.
I think you have a very good point. And the point is that there have not been very many films made like that. But we always have the classic example of Jean Cocteau, and I don't think that Blood of a Poet. And there are others in part. I think there's one thing that we have not investigated, and poetry need not always be lyric. There is no reason and why a poet like Mr. Thomas should not write a narrative, if he likes it, dramatic film with poetic language. And I think you will, as a matter of fact. I think you would have a wider audience than just anywhere else. I see no reason why you should not do a film that would have poetic language just exactly as Shakespeare would have written one of his plays, only it has poetic language. That is possible.
Yes, I agree entirely.
And I'm sure you will. Well, there's just anybody else that would like to say something? Yes?
The evening I heard Mr. Thomas's play Under the Milkwood. I was struck by its visual imagery as well as its language. And at the time, some months ago, when I mulled over the play, I began to visualize it in a series of shots, images, mood, and I began to say, gosh, what a tremendous film this would make. Not with Betty Grable, but if Flaherty could make it, or if Mr. Thomas could make it himself. Now, as a play, the images you set forth were able to form in the audience's mind. As a film, you would set more specific visual images in front of the audience. Would you find it an advantage to have the, say, more limited audience your play has, as a play, which can push forth into a group where they can form what they want from what you give them, or to get the larger audience that Mr. Miller spoke about earlier through a visual, technical medium with yourself at the helm?
Well, I'm all for having a much larger audience for that. The language in that was visual, and was meant to be, because you weren't seeing anything at all. It all had to be created in words. And those words could only be, if a film was going to be made of that play that you referred to, those words could really, apart from the dialogue, could only be in sort of camera instructions. They could director's instructions.
Yes, I think that would be possible.
And that would be possible.
But you see,
and your other thing was, you know, with me doing it. Well,
that's right.
I'm open.
And then
Any
you
offers?
see, then very frequently, where the language must describe, the visual part would describe, and you would use a different technique. That's all, as I see it. Well, at least this time we've reached a kind of agreement of a sort. Oh, is there someone here, please?
I'd like to know what you feel is the basic difference between poetic film as made by yourself or Miss Deren compared with commercial film of a director such as John
Huston. Well, I don't know what film you're talking about of John Huston's. I would say, primarily, and I think all of us would, I mean, we don't, none of us here scorn a sense of commercial film if we could do what we wanted to do. I think that the difference between Mr. Huston's film and my film is one of basic poetic concept of presenting it. He deals in, as we've said before, dramatic sequences, and it's a question of the language. Mr. Huston is not a poet. That's all. And if a poet did it, it would be completely different. That's all. I'm not trying to sidestep the thing. I'm just saying that the whole method would be different. And Mr. Miller has departed for the evening. He's a great playwright, I understand. But it's, oh, he's very sympathetic. Don't misunderstand me, please. Mr. Miller is just as much as interested in this problem as we are. He just doesn't happen to be working in the same medium that we are. But he will probably. He did work on a film which has never been released. And I know when he worked on that film, his approach was a great deal different than if he were working for the film. And that, I think, is the one major trouble with films in a way, even when they take Shakespeare. Shakespeare should never really be put in the film as it is. It was not written for it. I think the poets have to start writing for the film, and we have to get an audience that would accept them. I don't think that's so far away, really. They're just better writers, and I think that they will do it. Is that right, Mr. Tyler?
Well, a thought occurred to me that that I think you would admit, would you not, Mr. Maas, that the George Barker poem you used in your film is not ideally suited for film.
Oh, I agree with you. Yes.
Yes, and just as if Mr. Thomas redid Under Milk would, the final verbal form would be quite different from the form that exists now.
Well, I wouldn't want him to do that. I want him to write something new, you see,
well,
for the film. I mean, that's what I don't approve of. It's taking, just as Mr. Miller's play was put in the film, he himself saw the complications when it was put in. And when writers begin writing specifically for the film, with a knowledge of it, if some saw it, then perhaps we may have a unity of it, just as Shakespeare put in the film is not correct.
Yes, I think it's incorrect.
I think it's very incorrect.
I remember that at some point, Mr. Tyler made an observation to the effect that film had greatly influenced a great deal of modern poetry. And he hasn't had the chance to develop that, but it came to mind when when Mr. Thomas, when the remark came up that a great deal of Mr. Thomas's poetry in Milkwood could be replaced by images. Now, I think this does occur, that the poet labors to put into words and succeeds in putting into words images which actually he would be more comfortable in rendering directly as images. And it seems to me that this points up the great relationship between motion pictures and poetry, in that poetry, being a composite of images brought together by, let's say, an emotional logic, resembles the kind of montage which editing is in films. That is, the possibility of relating a series of images in film the way one can, and it's very closely related to poetry. I might say that before I made films, I was a poet, and I came to films because I was a poet. And to me, the process in both mediums is extremely similar. You are combining images, and I think that the poetry that would be written for film might be more abstract, because, for example, you couldn't have a commentary going on that invoked images which conflicted with the actual images that were being shown. You would create a poetry which was perhaps metaphysical or extremely abstract. In other words, it would not invoke images because you were handling that on the level of film. You were creating your images with the film, and the function of the verbal structure would then be somewhat different. That, I think, shows both the relationship between them and the possible collaboration between them.
Yes, and as a final word, I do think that we should not forget music, which is, even in Hollywood, a background part of it, but it shouldn't be. Music can state things just as well as poetry or verbal poetry or the visual image, and it must be a welding of those. And it's a very complicated problem that I think will, I hope, in the future be resolved. And I think if there are no more questions, we'll just... Oh, yes.
As I understand, it's a little bit confusing. When you want to write for the film, you are doing already commercial work. I understand that you should express what you feel as a poet when you are coming to the movies as a poet, and not to write for them. You have it in you, and then you want to project it. But when you have to write for them, then you are not yourself, that you are writing for them. After that qualification of whoever it is.
Well, Mr. Thomas knows that very well, because he's collected a few shekels, I suppose, that way. We were not talking really about that. But I do insist, and I think it is immensely rewarding to us, that there is an audience that gathers here once a month that will listen to this film, listen to poetic films and see them. With 3D, with the whole movie industry sort of collapsing this way, I think maybe the film will be restored to the creative people who may do something with it. It won't be possibly as great an audience, but all poetry today at least does not have such a great audience. Mr. Thomas is restoring it in a great way, and I think it may be done through the film too. Well, that's it.